Hi, this is Tom Alexander in Miami.
And I'm Walter Kolosky from Boston.
And this is the Jazz Rocks Podcast. Hey, Walter, welcome. Here we are. It is program number 2 of the Jazz Rocks Podcast. Very exciting.
We're back again.
And lots of fun stuff to talk about this week. We got a great guest coming up. It is keyboardist and drummer Gary Husband. We'll be talking to Gary in just a little bit. Just a lot of stuff. Some interesting news that occurred while we were away. I'm going to let you tell the folks about that.
The big news for Fusion fans everywhere is that hell froze over.
Yes, it did.
Jan Hammer last performed in public in 2006 in New York. I was happy to be there for the Moog Fest. That was his last public performance until, depending on when people are hearing this podcast, August 10th, he performed with Jeff Beck at the Hollywood Bowl. He made a guest appearance. Some of this video is on YouTube. You could knock me over with a feather. I never thought that this was going to happen again, but Jeff is celebrating 50 years in show business, and Jan finally said yes, and he went out and performed a couple of the hits from the 70s to an appreciative crowd of about 17,000 at the Hollywood Bowl.
Wow. That's amazing. If maybe only for one time to have him back. He was such a huge figure in this music, an important figure, and inspired so many musicians, not only with his playing, but his compositions. I mean, to have him back, even, again, like I said, even if it's just for one time only, exciting stuff, no?
Well, he really had about 3 periods there, because he was in the early days of Fusion, of course.
Right.
And then he was at the apex with Jeff Beck of Fusion, where Jeff's records were really selling.
Yeah.
The other period, actually it was 4 periods. The other period, of course, was the Miami Vice period, where people all over the country couldn't believe they never heard music like this before. And I used to laugh and said, well, you should listen to Mahavishnu from 10 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Because a lot of it has its basis in that. Where have you been all these years not listening to Jan Hammer?
Yeah.
And then in the 90s, I think the late 80s and early 90s, he started getting into these visual sound DVDs where he really sold tonnage. Yeah,
and to sort of augment or amend a little bit, the second period that you mentioned with Beck, I think you also have to include during that stretch his own band, the Jan Hammer Group, and his association with Al Di Meola as well, right?
All this period, I mean, he was really... You know, he was sort of a de facto guitar player, wasn't he?
Yeah.
If you really look at it.
Sure.
You know, and I remember the time I saw him with his band at Shabu, which was this place in Willimantic, Connecticut, which burned down many, many years ago. Mm-hmm. And he came out, and I hadn't seen him in a while. He opens up the set. Remember, he had sort of this early version of a guitar, and he opens up the set with Manic Depression. He might as well have been a guitar player.
Yeah.
And it was stunning. I always found it humorous, too, if you noticed on the back of all those albums.
Yeah, right. I know what you're going to say.
No one played guitar.
Right. There is no guitar on this album.
So, of course, he's just a giant.
Yeah.
And so very happy to see that he's played out.
It's great. A lot of excitement surrounding that appearance at the Hollywood Bowl in August. So today we were kind of batting around some ideas about, we talk about the origin of Fusion a lot. You know, there are those key albums, and we all both agree, I suppose, that Miles Davis was certainly the center of the universe in many ways with that stuff. What album was it for you, let's say, that was the one that said, okay, you know what, this is truly the new direction?
Yeah, I want to reposition that a little bit because, as we discussed in the first podcast, we went back and rediscovered.
Yes.
So we may have heard certain albums out of order. So the way I'm approaching the exercise today is, in hindsight, which of the Miles Davis albums provided the keystone for the direction, the future direction of jazz rock? Most people will say Bitches Brew was the key album. And from a commercial standpoint, they're certainly accurate. I think there's no arguing that. That was really the first jazz rock fusion album, if you want to call it that at that time, which I'm not quite so sure they were yet. that really obtained commercial success and opened up a lot of people's ears. But for me, the most important album of that period was a tribute to Jack Johnson, which was a soundtrack that Miles was contracted for a documentary of the same name about the great black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson. Now, I come from a certain place in fusion, and that, of course, is, I believe, the greatest band in the history of fusion was the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And although all the albums we talk about today included John McLaughlin, the leader of that band, to me, it's on a tribute to Jack Johnson. When you hear the opening strains of that album, it's all about John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham. And, of course, there's a great bass line with Michael Henderson. But in about 5 seconds, you are transported to a new land, fusion land.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. I think that first side is about 25 minutes. You know, that's another aspect of that early fusion music where it wasn't going to be heard on the radio, so you had these very long pieces. And with Miles Davis, you had a producer, Tio Macero, who would do some, let's say, creative cutting and pasting.
Yes.
With some of the sections of the music. The driving of those drums and the bass and McLaughlin's is sort of an echoing guitar motif and these riffs that he just builds and builds and builds. There's a couple of sections on there. How can he find another quarter note to build onto that previous run? And he does. You say, oh my God. And then, you know, when Miles, this story everybody tells is that this recording session was going on, and Miles happened to walk into the room in the middle of it. He ran over and picked up his trumpet. It was sort of a jam session that was going on. It wasn't, it wasn't the official recording at first. He came in there, and when he hits the first notes of that trumpet, oh my God, what a beautiful, inspiring piece of music this album is.
Yeah, no question. One of my favorite Miles Davis albums. Like you, I kind of was a little bit all over the place with the Miles stuff because I was just a little kid when it came out originally. But when I went back to sort of rediscover it, or discover it, I should say, for the first time, I didn't take it in order. And when I heard Jack Johnson, I had the same kind of reactions, like, man, this is really edgy and rocky and, driving. You use that word, and I couldn't agree with you more. Let's listen to a little snippet from Jack Johnson. Tell us what we're hearing here.
This is just the beginning of Jack Johnson. It just grabs you right away. Just the very beginning.
Here we go. That pretty much spells it out immediately. You know what you're getting into. This thing's going to groove hard, right?
Oh, absolutely. Back in the day, I had an old Hitachi turntable, and I used to put stack 3 records. Remember, you stack the records?
Yeah, sure.
And this is the way I went to sleep at night. I had to have music to go to sleep. Had to have it.
Mm-hmm.
So you put some of that on there, and most people would be kept awake by that music. But as aggressive as that music is, I find peace in it. I find resolve in it. I'm relaxed by it as well. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
that it's almost at a certain point, my heartbeat and the pulse of that music and other music like it, they beat as one.
Yeah.
And I go to sleep as a baby, and I always remember waking up the next day trying to remember, how far did I make it in the music last night?
Yeah.
Did I make it to the 10-minute mark?
Right.
Did I take 5 minutes, 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Now, I knew I was having a bad night when all the records had fallen.
Mm-hmm.
I am generally not a fan of these box sets and whatnot that give you all the outtakes, but I make a pure exception when it comes to the Jack Johnson box set, which I hope is still available. It has wonderful liner notes by who I think is the greatest fusion writer, Bill Makowski.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fascinating because you do hear all the takes, but you hear the interactions between, I'm talking the verbal interactions between Miles and the other guys.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean, it's
great.
in the background. You can't, it's not as loud as the music itself, but
Yeah.
you just hear things in the background that give you insight into the creativity that was taking place in these sessions, and it's over the top.
Yeah.
And to hear Miles, remember, Miles was discovering this music at the same time.
Right.
He was into Tony Williams, and he had just, in the last year or so, heard John McLaughlin and tried to steal him away from Tony and all those things that we all know about. But just to hear the emotion from Miles is worth this 5-box Jack Johnson set. So in closing, I would say this. I like Bitches Brew. I love, in a silent way, I love, love, love tribute to Jack Johnson.
Yeah. And before I share mine and how, I kind of feel might have been the birth of the whole thing, you mentioned about the stack of records on your turntable. Well, I had a similar experience. It was with an old GE clock radio that I had that was on my nightstand. And there was a program that was on late at night on the local NPR affiliate, hosted by a guy who's still there in the northeastern Pennsylvania area by the name of George Graham. He's an institution. He's been there for over 45 years. He used to have this show at night where he played this eclectic mix of music, and a lot of it was fusion. Now, this is like the mid-'70s, before I really knew kind of what it was, but I would put it on because there were no commercials. I loved it because it was the first time I heard like Jean-Luc Ponty and Chick Corea, not really processing, completely taking in, I just sort of knew them, on a peripheral basis. And it was just sort of music that lulled me into a safe place, as you sort of described, and kind of let you go to sleep. You'd set the clock radio for 30 minutes, and it would, by the time it went off, you were in dreamland. But
there are some people, they can't listen to that music fully awake.
Yeah. To get to my piece and the album specifically, and for the same reason you said, Bitches Brew is often considered, the one. But for me, it was the album before that. It was In a Silent Way from 1969. Certainly not quite as edgy by any stretch as edgy as Jack Johnson or even Bitches Brew. A little softer, but there were things bubbling under for me. There were things really emerging. And the track, It's About Time, you've got the three keyboard players. You got Zawinul playing organ and Herbie and Chick on electric pianos, and you get this stack. The kind of the groove is like this 6-chord passage that they keep building on, and they keep changing the harmony, and it really grooves. And you talk about Miles' audible, verbal exaltations, let's say, and you hear somebody. I don't know if it's Miles or if it's one of the other guys, but you hear someone in the studio go, "Woo." Just as they're getting going. If you listen really carefully, like in the first, 10 seconds, you hear it. And they're on to something, man. There's like an excitement there. And it's like, what? Something's happening here in the studio. We're not sure what it is because this is uncharted territory for everybody. And that, to me, I've experienced that personally in jams I've gotten into with musicians going way back to when I was first trying to figure all this stuff out, even to today, where things will just emerge. And that level of excitement, particularly when you consider you're in the studio with Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, Tony Williams, Dave Holland. I mean, it's like mind-blowing, the level of musicians in there with Miles. Imagine that first moment of discovery, that excitement of like this, no one's doing this. We're inventing this. It's like discovering a new world, like the explorers.
That section of music, too,
yeah,
is unlike anything leading up to it, which is what that song is. It's basically a standard. That aspect of In a Silent Way
Right.
is still played today because it stood out, I think. That melody that Joe Zawinul came up with, and it's played around with McLaughlin and the others,
Right.
is just so beautiful.
Just amazing stuff, and it's kind of cool that you and I both had a little different opinion, but we both agree that Miles was the sort of the center of the universe for this.
Well, they don't call them the Sons of Miles for nothing.
Yeah.
It's like Miles Davis. The story in one of the Miles Davis bios about him going to a White House dinner, and he's getting picked up in a limo, and other people in the limo with him.
Mm-hmm.
And an older couple, I think it was a white-haired woman and her husband, were there, all dressed.
Yep.
And they introduce themselves, and they have no clue who Miles Davis is at all. I'm sure he has no clue who they were. And so the woman says, "We're so-and-so, and we did this. Who are you, and what did you do?" And Miles says, "Oh, I just changed music 4 or 5 times."
Yeah.
We'll talk about this period of Miles just a little bit with Gary Husband coming up, but that's my take. I'm a tribute to Jack Johnson all the way.
Gary Husband next on the Jazz Rocks podcast. Stay tuned, everybody.
The Jazz Rocks podcast is brought to you in part by Moon June Records. Progressive music that explores the boundaries of jazz, rock, avant-garde, and the unknown. Moon June brings you Alan Holdsworth, Stickmen, Barry Cleveland, Dewa Bujana, Balletto, John Etheridge, Soft Machine Legacy, Marvin, Dwiki Darmawan, and many more of today's most exciting international artists. Visit moonjune.com and discover the exciting world of today's leading progressive sounds.
This is Mark Wingfield, saluting you from England. You're listening to the Jazz Rocks podcast with Tom Alexander and Walter Kolosky.
Drummer-pianist Gary Husband turned professional at the age of 13. At 16, he was the full-time drummer for the renowned British bandleader Sid Lawrence's orchestra. He would go on to stints with Mike Carr, Barbara Thompson, Gary Boyle, and many others, and often performed at the famous Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London. His career in jazz rock music has seen the release of brilliant solo albums and fruitful partnerships in the bands of Alan Holdsworth, Billy Cobham, Jack Bruce, John McLaughlin, and so forth. Jazz Rocks welcomes Gary Husband. Hi, Gary.
Hey, Walter. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Gary, how are
Tom,
you?
I mean.
Before we got you on the phone this morning, Tom and I were discussing the merits of several Miles Davis albums as they related to the importance and direction of fusion music. Most people say it's all about Bitches Brew, but there were other albums like In a Silent Way, tribute to Jack Johnson, Live Evil, for example. Where do you come down on this issue? Did any of these albums have a larger effect on you than the others?
Completely. But the age I was when all this was transmitting to me, which shall we say, it seemed like it was the most natural thing. You know, I was getting on buses with a brass band going to play like very traditional music. But listening to this Tony Williams Lifetime compilation cassette, to the delight of everybody on the bus, not.
Yeah.
And, I didn't have headphones or anything, so I was just kind of whatever I heard, everybody else heard. And I was just thinking, like, this was just contemporary electric, contemporary commonplace music. You know, as fantastic as it was, I just thought, well, this is just everything that I need. And, of course, all the Miles records, because of the kind of, I was born in 1960, so by the time I was actually offered a chance to go and see Tony Williams Lifetime, I had no idea what it was. Of course, I was 12 years old, 10 years old even, maybe 9. I'm not sure which year they first started touring.
Who was playing guitar when you saw them?
It was John.
Wow, you were young.
Wow.
John McLaughlin and Jack Bruce and
wow.
And Larry Young, but I mean, I didn't see it. I just heard about it,
right.
and I got offered a ticket, and I had no idea. But I had to work backwards when elements were really colliding and really coming together.
Of those albums, does one stick out for you? I mean, I'm thinking, I think there's sort of a quartet of them: Live Evil, Jack Johnson, Silent Way, Bitches Brew, or is that just tangential to your other discoveries?
No, well, it kind of had a lot to do with where I was, which was pretty much just flying throughout the universe in those days. I was just any experience I could get, I was ready for in terms of music. And those albums, they didn't come to me sort of upon release kind of thing. Like I say, I was working back all the time and discovering. I think we all
did. A lot of us did that.
Yeah, I think, it's inevitable. But they were all really important, and they all still are really, really important to me today in terms of pure love, really. I just love them. I love everything about them. And they each stick out for reasons, respectively, for what they are, how they sound, what they did, how they came across to me, which was everything, what did I feel? It brings up where you were, who you were with, and what you were going through in the time of your life and so forth. And those records still really do it for me.
Oh, so. Me too. Now, before this had occurred, you had been classically trained on piano. What I ask everybody that's ever done that is, was it your choice? And secondly, what gave you your open ears? Was it the house you lived in? I love the story that you tell about your dad bringing home music that he may not like, but he would bring it home for you so that you would understand what's going on.
Yeah, that revealed a very special quality in him, I think, because he could see beyond his taste. He was going on the word of others, invariably younger musicians that he'd get to work with because he worked in the session world. And records were coming out around that time, and people, he was asking, like, what should my son be listening to? And people would give him cassettes of albums. You see, we were bootlegging even then, Tom. and these records would come, and I'd always want his musical approval because I respected him so much as a musician, and I'd say things like, well, that's great, I've never heard of these people, and do you like it? And he'd go, no, but, this is exactly what you should be listening to right now, so go upstairs and do whatever you want with it, which was just fantastic, It really speaks of him in a way that I really respect.
Yeah, that's great that, a parent or an influential figure like that can get you started early and almost be selfless, I think, to just sort of get you exposed to everything.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, selfless, yeah.
Yeah. Being a keyboard player myself, Gary, I find it interesting that you're classically trained on piano, but you're self-taught on drums. Now, obviously not too uncommon, but you're able to perform at such high levels. You can virtually interchange the instruments at the highest caliber, playing, with all these different bands. What makes you decide what instrument you're going to play for each artist? For instance, does your musical mind say, okay, I'm a drummer for Alan Holdsworth, I'm a keyboard player for John McLaughlin? How does that work?
Well, that's usually up to them. It's like, oh yeah, I'm playing drums, so he's got to play keyboard, kind of thing. The thing is, I think it was inevitably down to them in terms of what instruments they played, and also, of course, what kind of band it was towards, or what kind of project, and who was already established in the fold in the aggregation. So at that point, it's like with John, he primarily at that point when I started working with him, he needed a keyboard player, and he wanted somebody who was very equally specialist on piano. Right. But at the same time, he wanted the extra dimension of the drum side of me as well, which we continues through to this day in the band that we love and perform with still now, the Fourth Dimension. With Billy, actually, I used to do the same thing. Back in the 90s, we had two drum kits on stage, but he'd go to percussion.
Wow, that's great. We're speaking with keyboardist and drummer Gary Husband. Gary, I got to tell you, this is extra exciting for me because you and I have a connection of sorts. In that you recorded a composition of mine that I wrote for guitarist John Fifield. That album is coming hopefully soon down the line. You know how these independently produced albums can take a little while getting to market, but
I know something about that.
A little bit. But Gary, I'm so honored that you actually played on a composition I wrote called "Looks Like Home." Wow, I could just say that it's very exciting.
I had a couple of stabs at it because it's an intriguing little number. I mean, it really captivated my attention because it's got a very sweet side about it in the way that it moves and the melody, but there's something just with some edge to it.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting formically as well, the way it's put together, the way it goes. It's an intriguing little number. I liked it a lot, and
thank you.
It was a privilege to play on it.
Oh, well,
thank you.
The honor is certainly all mine. Thank you so much.
And there are your liner notes for John.
Yes, absolutely. Those are the liner notes for John Fifield when that album does come out. Exactly.
Oh, that's nice. I hope it does.
It will. I should say that I did hear the pre-mix of the tracks, and believe me, it lived up to all the billing. I was just thrilled to hear it, and so I'm really excited for the release.
Oh, that's kind of you, Tom. Thanks. Yeah, me too.
Okay, so we have our mutual admiration club. We're going to switch now to talking about the drummers that had the most effect on you, Gary, and I'm jazz rock speaking. So I would say, would it be safe to say the big two are Tony Williams and Billy Cobham, or should that group be expanded? And were there I know it's hard for anyone to pick out particular albums, but were there particular albums from those guys that really grabbed your attention?
Yeah, I have to say Spectrum, because this was a coming together. Whenever I think about successful music, I think about successful integration. And as I feel about myself and yourself, Walter, we've spoken about many times about Mahavishnu, that it was an intriguing coming together of people, the elements and the people and their roots that came together in that. I mean, a violin with very much a classical presence to it. For me, the all-time favorite keyboard player was Jan Hammer, but it was only because I felt the Eastern Europe of Jan, and I really responded to that because I'd been involved in a lot of that music, and even the Bartok microcosmos system, which was primarily exercises, but they were veiled. I mean, there was this bitonality coming across in everything. It was almost like this was the subliminal teaching to the microcosmos. If classical pianists people who've been through it will know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and this was very evident in Jan's voicings, his rhythmic sense, and altogether individuality, I think. So this guy really captivated me. Majestic rhythmic feeling from him. I mean, it's like that real beautiful on it thing.
You saw that he just came out of retirement for a night, right?
I did, yeah. and it's great. It's great. But man, I miss that sound of the late '70s. I've got to say, and I would tell him the same thing. I mean, his notes and his sensibility and his musicality. What's special about him will never leave me behind. But I miss that sound.
I think, too, with all those guys that we all loved in the 70s, you mentioned Jan, of course, a huge influence on you, Herbie, those guys, Chick and Zawinul and all those guys, it was the time. It was their time there. And when I say time, I'm not talking about era. I'm talking about actual physical time that they could play. And just the rhythm was just absolutely on a different level from perhaps keyboard players that you may have heard as a little kid or something, but it's just amazing. They just took it to a whole other level. And for you, I know Bill Evans was a major influence in the early days from piano standpoint. What other keyboard players played a role in your development? What music moved you the most from that collective of great keyboard players of the 70s?
It's strange that I kind of avoided keyboard players. I went through some piano players, and Bill Evans was a favorite, as you picked up on, because there was this crystal clarity in his improvisational formation all the time, and there was this poetic sense. There was such a lyrical thing. There was such a, how do you define this thing in words and not music? It's pretty hard, but there was this clear, striking voice, and it didn't involve things that, to me, that I'd recognize, and this would not be ever a put down to anybody, but phrases that are familiar to a piano player, and you and I know what that's about, Tom. You can hear things that are almost like right under the hand.
Yeah.
You can hear it in guitarists too.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
With stuff that is very convenient, shall we say, from a physical point of view on the instrument. But I didn't hear any of that from Bill. I just heard pure invention. And glorious invention. You can buy albums now and hear 3 or 4 takes of certain things, and each one of them, it's just glorious from start to finish. I enjoyed Joe Zawinul on another kind of level. It was almost more of an integral thing, a textural thing, almost.
So you've been producing your own solo work for years, from the nuts and the bolts all the way to the end. I'd call it fusion music, even if it's electrified or not. Notably, The Things I See, which is a tribute to Alan Holdsworth's compositions, a solo piano album. Meeting of Spirits, which is the same take on McLaughlin's compositions. You had these volumes 1 and 2 of Dirty and Beautiful that featured these tremendous collaborations. And a couple of years ago, you did an album with guitarist Alex Mahacek. What did this experience of conceiving and completing and playing with these musicians on these projects teach you?
Humility, I guess. In the case of some individuals, tolerance, I have to say, mentioning no names. Like, there's nothing like the feeling of getting no solos about 2 weeks before the record's supposed to be released. But I won't go any further with that.
I think I'm asking this because it's different than being the sideman. I mean, you're responsible for everything.
I think the biggest bonus to me, if I can call it that, was when I first met Alan and we started playing together. It's like time and the time of day it was and whether or not we were hungry all went out of the window in that one afternoon. And by the time we both opened our eyes, it was dark outside. The other musicians had gone home. We had no idea when. I mean, it was just an experience. Like, my God, I found a place with this guy, and I would have never expected it to happen. It was just an extremely fortunate turn of events that caused me to meet him at exactly the time I did, which was really the only time it could have happened. And I knew that the within that relationship were the building blocks to develop exactly what I wanted to do, and I was right about that. With the Dirty and Beautiful, actually, I tried to get John and Alan together, and it's just not really common knowledge, but Dirty and Beautiful. It was about those two. And, for one reason or 1,000, this could have never really happened.
Yeah,
but
that's what I was about to say. Sometimes,
Yeah, I'm afraid not. I did not succeed with that, and I would not try it again. I was going to produce them, too. I was going to get John to play through an amp and make this unearthly noise, just like he used to do. Because when when you want to work with people, you find out about as much as you can from them. And I was totally engrossed in interviews in my youth, because, of course, we didn't have any internet or anything. So I was always trying to just read about as much as I could find out about them. And in terms of the interviews were great because that was coming straight from their mouth.
And then you met them in real life.
And then I met them in real life, yeah, all of them. I'm telling you. Mm. But they have to be. You know, when I met Tony Williams, I met him once in my life, and it was a dreadful experience. And he was just awful to me.
Oh, that's too bad.
Oh, yeah, I know, because I knew that you could be really sweet, and you could be a pussycat, and you could be beautiful to people. I know. But I knew that there was this other side. But in a way, when you get involved, you know, when you listen to Emergency as many times as I did and turn it over, you knew there was somebody pretty complex. I mean, to be singing bossa nova with this tuneless voice and having the organ play this, like, madness, you know, harmonic madness there.
I always get the sense with Tony that he was always chasing Lifetime after it ended. Did you sense that at all?
Yeah, I felt that too.
He was always chasing that.
I did. I mean, I enjoyed the second one too, because this is around the time I'm like about 15, 16 when these albums, when the albums are actually starting to come out. I remember when Visions of the Emerald Beyond came out. I remember when Believe It came out, and I was buying the records and just staring at the cover, you know.
I think Believe It is one of those albums that's it's a landmark for fusion fans and musicians alike. I think that it's just one of those albums that just came along. I mean, it had a loose feel to it in many ways, but the energy, the beauty of it's so 6 compositions, and it just has a timelessness about it. And I know that even now, 41 years later, I keep going back to that album.
Oh, I do too. There are certain times, and I'm like, I want to hear Believe It, you know, and they're all kind of there. It's like I can see the album covers in my head, you know.
Yep.
Well, you have to do these days, don't you, with MP3s?
Yeah.
I know you're still resting from long tour. When you get caught up on your sleep, what's in the pipeline, Gary?
I'm kind of writing towards things. There's a Norwegian guitarist and programmer, specifically, that I'm really interested in, and I've really been hearing a kind of an electro kind of programming kind of route to a new project. And it'd only be very small, maybe even a trio, or at the most a quartet. And that'll be kind of like a drums project for me. And his name is Alf Terrier Hana. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard of him, but doing some great things.
Let me ask you one quick question about the equipment itself, the keyboards and stuff. Do you find that when these new keyboards come out, you'll hear a sound, you'll be inspired by a particular sound that will kind of take you to a whole new area of composition, a way of thinking that you may not have thought of with a previous sound, an older sound?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I cannot chorus that more. It in actual fact, it only happened this morning because I was up at the studio just doing some writing, and it's like an idea I've already got, and because I was just looking at a few different things for it, I ended up changing the whole piece because of this one sound. So it led the direction and the kind of sonic presence of the way this thing was happening in a very, very different way, and that all changed this morning.
It's almost like having a palette, right? You're an artist, a painter, and you've got a palette of colors that you've always used, and then suddenly you wake up one morning, and there's a new color you've never seen before, and it's right. It's kind of almost like that.
Absolutely, I agree entirely with you. But behind all this, we've just got to have the will, haven't we? And we've got to have the conviction and the absolute unshakable will. I mean, I was talking to John McLaughlin about this just the other day, and I actually happened to christen him that because I'd heard a lecture on mid-Beethoven, late Beethoven, and because of this, I said, you know what, I'm going to dub you the man that defies the notion that musicians get mellower as they get older. and to an extent, actually, this happened with Beethoven, too. I think that's perfect for John, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a perfect description of the way he approaches music to me. Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, we get the pleasure of listening to both of you, Gary, and the other band members when you go on tour and play. And we hope to see you soon. We really appreciate you taking the time
it's my pleasure.
to talk to us this morning. What we appreciate here at the Jazz Rocks podcast. We really do. So thanks so much, Gary.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
We'll certainly try to have you on again in the near future. Thank you. That's Gary Husband, keyboardist, drummer, all the way from London, England, and we'll return right after this word.
Hi, I'm Tony Levin of Stickman and Levin Brothers. You are listening to the Jazz Rocks podcast with Tom Alexander and Walter Kolosky.
From Here to There is the latest revelation from the phenomenal guitarist Wolfgang Sharp. For years, Wolfgang has been cornering the market on progressive guitar sounds and fusion ensemble play. From Here to There, recently chosen by Downbeat magazine as an album pick of the month, is another giant leap. Learn more about Wolfgang and how to get from here to there at frameupmusic.com. That's frameupmusic.com.
This is Rick Laird. You are listening to the Jazz Rocks podcast with Tom Alexander and Walter Kolosky.
Welcome back to the Jazz Rocks podcast. Along with Walter Kolosky, I am Tom Alexander. And Walter, excited to mention, let the fans know that we are now up on iTunes. You can catch the show, the podcast, on iTunes. Just search Jazz Rocks Podcast. That's simple. It's very, very easy. It'll come right up for you, and you can listen to the episodes right here. Right there, I should say.
Fantastic, right. On SoundCloud and iTunes.
Yeah, SoundCloud and iTunes. So
no excuses not to listen.
No, not at all. It's that time again. It's time for Then and Now.
Welcome to Then and Now. Tom and I listen and discuss a fusion classic from the past, and then we explore contemporary sounds, illustrating why jazz rock is as vital today as it's always been.
All right, here we go. We did this last time where I got to pick the old tune, you picked the new tune. This time we reverse it, and you get to pick an older fusion piece. Why don't you share with us your selection?
I've chosen a piece from when fusion was fun. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Right. Fusion could be fun. Even if it was technically amazing, it could still be fun.
Yeah.
I like foreboding fusion, but I like fun fusion too. This week we go back to a recording, at least the recording took place in 1975. It was released again, actually released for the first time, by Promising Music, the Promising Music label, as part of its Live Love Series Volume 1. And we're going to feature Larry Coryell and the 11th House. This is a live performance of the 11th House Blues.
There you go, 11th House Blues from 11th House with Larry Coryell on guitar, Alphonse Mouzon on drums, Mike Mandel keyboards, Mike Lawrence on trumpet. And who was playing bass? Was that Lee or was that?
Yeah, it was John Lee.
John Lee. Okay, great ripping stuff and like you said, fun.
Yeah, and I chose this for a few reasons. I always choose music for a reason, Tom.
Yeah, sure.
Number one, as we record this, Larry Coryell is recovering from a health crisis, and we want to wish him well.
Yes.
And so I've been thinking about him, and which made me bring this CD out of my shelves in anticipation of this podcast. And, of course, a very important fixture in the history of jazz fusion. And I also chose this because I happen to write the liner notes for this release. And very proud of that. And the liner notes basically reiterated what we just discussed a few moments ago about how fusion could be fun. It was accepted by people. And this was a great time. On another note, I also picked it because of the trumpet player, Mike Lawrence, who tragically died very young. He was an amazing trumpet player and destined to be a fusion superstar on trumpet. And if people go back and listen to that again, his role reminds me of Jerry Goodman's in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. It almost sounds like a violin, his phrasing and the way he doubles up with some other players. But we wish Larry well, and you should pick this up. Larry Coryell in the 11th House, January 1975. It's from the Life, Love series, Volume 1 from Promising Music. And that's my then.
All right. Well, a great choice. Time for now. I select a track from just last year from an album by the great Peter Erskine, perhaps most famously with his stint with Weather Report in the late 70s, early 80s. And this is an album called Dr. Of course, you put that together, it's drum, Dr. again from 2015. Love the cover, by the way. It's done as an old 1950s sci-fi movie poster. It's actually very, very cool cover.
Yeah, these are for people that buy CDs.
Yeah, that know what covers are. And I'll tell you something. I mean, listen. I'm going to just go off road for 1 second. Part of the process, the great excitement of getting an album too, was looking at the album artwork, reading the liner notes. Right. Well, I could tell you, yes. Listen, when my new release comes out in September, hopefully, if everything works out, I included a digital booklet with it, because it matters. Come on, it does matter. I think people who love this music want to know about the session. They want to learn a little bit about the recording. Anyway, Dr. Cool album cover. But let's get back to reality here. I'll come back down to earth. Dr. features John Beasley on keyboards, Yannick Guizdala, and I'm sure I slaughtered that, on bass, Bob Shepard on sax. Nice record, by the way. And it's kind of almost, a lot of it reminds me of some Weather Report. In fact, there's a Weather Report piece on there, or a Zavinul piece. Just a nice groove called Lost Page. Here is Peter Erskine from Dr. Peter Erskine, Dr. The name of the tune, Lost Page. Walter?
What I like about it, lots of times I say things hoping that somebody else will understand them. That tune, the chord progression in it sort of has a dark undertone, but the song has a positive message.
Mm-hmm.
You hear that in it? That's what I hear.
I sort of walks that tightrope a little bit. And I just really like how it's sort of structured. It's not really super complex. Just has a really nice feel, but a little darkness to it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for Erskine is this album sort of marks a return to fusion in a purer sense. I think he's been playing sort of as a minimalist for quite some time now.
Yeah, airy-ish. Kind of real airy feel, yeah.
Right, and here is sort of a return to fusion. There's a little bit of 80s sound in that thing, I think. Mm-hmm. The sax playing, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but it's a return to form for Erskine, who is playing a little more. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
He's playing a little more on that.
Yeah, there's more. Right, and I think it's just more written out. I think it's more scored, so to speak, so there's actual drum parts that play along with the other instruments, as opposed to sort of, providing a bed, a just kind of soft, airy bed for them to just blow over. But I really enjoyed it, and I can't recommend it enough. Dr. Peter Erskine. Walter, another show down, more to come. We had a lot of fun today. Got to talk a little bit about our takes on Miles Davis, the birth of fusion. Our guest, of course, was the great Gary Husband. And, of course, the big news of Jan Hammer making a return, maybe one time only, but it happened.
Yeah, Gary is a joy to talk to. I've had the pleasure of talking to him many, many times.
Yep.
And it was just fantastic to talk to him once again. I'm happy we're on iTunes now.
Yes.
I'm already looking forward to podcast number 3.
Same here. And as you mentioned, iTunes. Got to remind listeners again, we are now on iTunes officially. Just search podcast section. Very simple. Jazz Rocks Podcast, the name of the show. That's it. And you'll find us. Just click on that and you got it. You're there listening with everybody else. We will return next month for another edition of Jazz Rocks Podcast. From Miami, I'm Tom Alexander.
From Boston, I'm Walter Kolosky.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
The Jazz Rocks Podcast with Tom Alexander and Walter Kolosky is produced at Studio Alpha in Miami in association with Alexander Productions. If you'd like to advertise on the Jazz Rocks Podcast, send a note to info@alexanderproductions.com. Visit us on Twitter @JazzRocksPC. Our SoundCloud page is Jazz Rocks Podcast.